before we turn the machine on, a couple of components on the actual interface of the machine that I just wanted to draw your attention to. So you can see that we have this screen in the middle here. This is where all of our patient data and our ventilation settings are going to be displayed once the machine is in operation. We also have the power on or off button here, and you can see there's also an LED light here that's indicating that this is currently plugged in and has power from the main supply. Other buttons to note here, silence button, and then we have a navigation button with arrows up and down, and then we also have selection buttons on both the left and the right, but the options for those buttons will actually be displayed at the bottom end of this screen here. So in order for us to be able to set up the ventilation parameters that we want for our patient, we can actually do that without needing to turn the machine on. We can get into a settings screen. So in order to be able to access that settings screen, we need to use the scroll down button and our silence button, and we need to press those both together, and we now come into the setup screen. So SD card, just ignore. We're now going to scroll down into our settings and alarms, and as you can see there is the select option here, which means I use this selection key here to select that. Dual prescription. For the purposes of CPAP and BiPAP, we ignore this setting. This must be set to off. The next selection we have down now is the mode. So we are either going to be using CPAP, or we're going to be using this ST mode, spontaneous timed, or otherwise known as BiPAP mode. So in order to be able to change those, we need to choose the modify option here. So I will now select this button. That now brings it over into this section here, and I can then now use my navigation key in order to scroll. So you can see that I can scroll up and down. So two modes that we will be using, ST, BiPAP, or scrolling to CPAP. Those are the only two modes that we will be using on this machine. So for the initial setup, I'll run through how we set up CPAP, because the principles will then be transferred into how we set up the BiPAP as well. So we're happy with the mode that we've chosen. The next one down that you can see is circuit type. Now that is just referring to the actual ventilator tubing that we've already set up in the machine. And as you know from the initial bit, we've already removed the sensor connection from that. So what we need to ensure here is that we actually have this set to a passive circuit, which it is, so I'm happy. I now move down into the next one is AVAPs. That is not something that we need to be worrying about for the purposes of this, so we need to ensure that is set to off. So it's defaulted back to CPAP. So we've got our passive circuit type. Flex needs to be off for the purposes of what we do, and now we're coming down into the actual ventilator settings. I'm just going to scroll that so we can see those on the screen a little bit more clearly. So at the top we have our CPAP. Most patients, when they are initiated onto CPAP, you would start with a low setting of CPAP. So a setting of 5 centimetres of water is a really good starting place for normal ventilation parameters. However, if you are setting this up and you're using this for your COVID patients, then please refer to the guidance that has been circulated, where we will be using much higher initiating CPAP settings. So if that was the case and we needed to adjust that, we would simply use our modify button again, which brings us to here, and then we would scroll our CPAP setting, and the guidelines are currently saying a minimum of 10 centimetres of water for a CPAP setting as your starting pressure. So that's how you would modify that. Next, then you press OK to say you're happy with that, and it will automatically take you to the next parameter to be set on the list, which is our fraction of inspired oxygen. This is not litres of oxygen, because we are directly attaching this into the high flow oxygen that we have on our walls. So modify, as you can see, it is a percentage of oxygen. If we wanted to, even set it at 21%, and we can now ventilate a patient on air if that was what was required for them against their target saturations. But most patients will be requiring a level of oxygen. So in fact, you can set this all the way up. As you can see, this is going up incrementally now. We've got that on 50, 60, 70, whatever percentage of oxygen you need to be setting this patient on. So once you're happy with the fraction of inspired oxygen that you've set, you now press the OK button. It's now coming down to something called ramp length. So ramp length is purely the time that you want the machine to take to get to the settings that we've chosen. So this is a really, really important function for you to be utilising when you are initiating non-invasive ventilation therapy on patients. So my advice is the longer the time you can give for the machine to get up to the maximum settings, the better patient compliance that you've got. But you will have to assess this on patient by patient depending on what situation you're using this. So if I wanted to modify that, again, press the modify, and in an ideal situation, I would want this to ramp up incrementally the pressure that it's providing to the patient. Over 30 minutes would be my ideal preference, but obviously that may be adjusted dependent on patient need. So the ramp start pressure. So what the machine is asking you here is, okay, so you've told me you want me to get up to a CPAP of 10 centimetres of water. What level do you want me to start at? So 4 is a good place. Normal intrinsic PEEP for adults is around about 2 centimetres of water. It's quite low. So already by setting it at 4, we're already offering more support to this patient's respiratory function than they would already have as a natural reserve for them. So setting it at 4 centimetres is fine. You may want to have a slightly higher ramp start pressure if you are starting at much higher CPAP pressures. So we will leave that as that is. Next one down you can see is nebulizer enabled. The only areas in which nebulizers are being used with the Trilogy machine is AMU at the Royal Berks Hospital. So please ensure that if you are working outside of AMU and you do not have the nebulizer component that is added into the machine, this needs to be set at unavailable. So I'm now going to scroll down. Circuit disconnect alarm. Currently that's set off. That's not what we want it set on. So this alarm will tell us if any section of the tubing has come disconnected, or if the patient leak from the face mask interface is so large that the machine is unable to continue delivering ventilation safely to the patient. So what we would like to do now is modify that, and actually we'd like that on at about 20 seconds, because if you think about patients' normal breathing, the last thing we'd want them to be doing is not breathing for any longer than 20 seconds. So that would be my default. Apnea alarm, exactly the same principles as the disconnect alarm. This is telling the machine I do not want this patient to be breathing not breathing for any longer than 20 seconds before you alarm and tell me that they're not breathing. For the purposes of this, to simplify this for everybody, when it comes to the high and low tidal volume, minute volume and respiratory alarms, volume alarms, I would suggest that we turn those off currently. But you may want to set a low respiratory rate alarm and a high respiratory rate alarm, dependent on what your patient's parameters are, and you can adjust those as therapy progresses with the patient. So once you're happy that you have set your parameters, the next thing that we do now, you can see there's a finish option underneath this selection key. So once I select that, the machine essentially goes into a standby mode. but the machine is now set and it will save those settings for us, which means then we can now move the machine to our patient, and the only thing that we have to do now at the patient's bed space is to attach the machine to the mask that we've previously fitted.